Hi, and welcome to another episode of Civs 101. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be considering Norway, led in Civilization 6 by Harald Hardrada. While Civ 6 marks the first time Norway has been a playable Civ, the depiction of Norway in this game makes it a very easy stand-in for the old Viking Civ, which appeared in Civilizations 2, 3, and 4. Norway also plays a starring role in Civ 6's Dark Age scenario, called Vikings, Traders, and Raiders. To help me consider the depiction of Norway and the Vikings in this game, I'm joined on today's episode by Dr. Daniel Melleno. Dr. Melleno is Assistant Professor of Medieval History at the University of Denver, and he specializes in the history of early medieval Europe. His research focuses on cross-cultural relationships in the pre-modern world, with a particular interest in the Vikings and their impact on the wider European world. Fans of History Respawned will remember Dr. Melleno from our episodes on Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Daniel, welcome to Civs 101.
Thank you. It's great to be here again.
Great. So I start each episode of Civs 101 with the same question for my guest, and that is, what is your experience with the Civilization series?
Yeah, I started playing Civ, I think around Civ 4 is the earliest that I remember. I may have encountered it prior to that, but I don't have any strong memories. But I distinctly remember playing Civ 4 on a really chugging laptop during college in an airport. Like, that's my abiding memory is of, like, it just really giving its all. And then I played Civ 5 and bought Civ 6, as a day one purchase. And so I, not from the very earliest days, but a fair amount of experience with it, which means that I have no excuse for being as bad at it as I am. But yeah, and I actually, from a teaching perspective, I use the Civ games a lot because there's really something just perfectly distilled about this idea of like a civilization, right? So I talk about, we look at Harald Hardrada in my Viking class, and we look at Civ for a lot of different things in a couple of different classes, right? Because I teach a class where we talk about like the conquest of Mexico, for instance, and there's a great sort of, you've got Cortez, and you've got, in an earlier scenario package, you've got the Aztecs as a civilization. So there's a lot of like good chunky sort of video game teaching stuff in there.
For sure. And I think, despite the fact that neither you or I proclaim to be any good at Civilization, it's a pretty easy game, I think, for young players to pick up. And by young, I mean, people new to the genre. I feel like Civilization as a series has a pretty easy onboarding process.
Yeah, I think in some ways that's the problem for me, is that it's deceptively straightforward, but there's, as they say, a meta to it that I'm just really, my brain has never wrapped around.
Yeah.
So I can happily click buttons and click buttons and click buttons, and then I realize that I'm like somehow supremely far behind all of the computer players, and I'm playing on, settler difficulty.
I'm not much better. I think I'm playing on Prince right now, which is one of the lower difficulties. And as you can see here, I have picked a random map that is, I think, based on archipelagos, which plays into the favor of the Norwegians, who are very much a naval-based civilization. And so you can see I've got my kind of set of cities here, these two cities, couple of city-states that have joined my cause. And then I've begun exploring the wider reaches of this world with the Viking longship, which is a really handy early civilization, kind of ancient era, classical era unit, which you can use to explore pretty easily, around whatever map you're playing.
Which is, of course, one of the hilarious things about the Civ games and the way that they conceptualize, right? Because the Viking longship is very much a medieval type of thing, but if you're placing everybody next to each other, it makes sense for them to start. The Vikings, the ancient world of the Viking is the medieval world, effectively speaking.
Well, yeah, if we're thinking in terms of civilizations, they kind of like to play into stereotypes. And, I think when they're thinking about balancing this game, between different civs, they want to make sure that the Vikings can represent their Vikingness, pretty early on, I think.
Yeah.
So next question for you is, the leader of Norway and the kind of stand-in for the Vikings in this game is Harald Hardrada. And previous versions of Civilization, as I'd said at the top, they'd featured other Viking leaders. It was actually called the Viking Civilization. They had Canute the Great, they had Ragnar Lothbrok, and now they've got Harald. And I'm wondering, what do you make of Hardrada as a representative figure for the Vikings? And following on that, are there any other potential candidates that you think would make for a good leader for either Norway or for a mythical Viking civ?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think the last in Civ 5, if I remember correctly, it was Harald Bluetooth, so Denmark, right? And this time we've got Harald. They're all Haralds. This is one of the eternal sort of pains of my particular area of expertise and field, is that everybody's named Charles and Harold. So you just end up with these very elaborate multi-clausal sentences when you're writing about it, where you have to explain which Harold you're talking about. I think he's actually a really great choice, both for Norway, and especially if you're going to go Viking Age. He's a great choice. I actually feature him very heavily in my Viking seminar, because he really is this sort of transitional character who checks off so many boxes. He starts off essentially as an exile. So he is the half-brother of Saint Olaf, who would be another interesting choice, I guess. But he's the half-brother of Saint Olaf, and when Saint Olaf gets himself, quote-unquote, martyred, it's a little bit debatable about whether getting killed by a peasant revolt is martyrdom. But, he gets himself martyred, and Harold has to go into exile, and he ends up basically, he's a teenager, a pretty young teenager, and he ends up going down onto what's called the Austerweg, the Eastern Way, and he ends up at Constantinople, Mikkelgard, where he serves as basically a mercenary general for a number of years, and he has this wild career where he's involved in Byzantine, Eastern Roman politics, and he's raiding in the Holy Land and in the Eastern Mediterranean and all around that sort of area. Gets thrown in jail at one point, and a lot of this is based, it should be noted, on a text called the Heimskringla, which is written by Snorri Sturluson, who's sort of the big guy who gives us a lot of our information about the Viking Age, even though he is not from the Viking Age. So he writes this long king saga about all the kings of Norway, including Harold. So he gets tired of the Byzantine world and decides to head back up, marries a Rus princess, right? So he's hooked into the Norse diaspora in a really interesting way, ends up coming back, raiding around Scandinavia for a while, until his nephew, who is king in Norway, sort of realizes that he's not going to be able to get rid of this guy, and they become co-kings, right? So he goes from being the half-brother of a king to a Varangian Viking raider to a co-king, right? All in the span of his life. And then as king, he spends a whole bunch of time both sort of solidifying the kingdom of Norway. Really, this is the period we're talking 11th century. This is the period where we could start to talk about kingdoms. And he does a lot of stuff that looks like both kind of like a Viking and kind of like a king. And of course, he famously bites it by deciding that he wants to conquer England during the great succession crisis of 1066, right? So he dies abroad in northern England, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, like fighting English people, just like Canute did, you know. Well, Canute didn't die, Canute conquered, you know, but just like lots and lots of Vikings before him. So he's this really weird sort of great transitional character who is almost not quite medieval, if we're using this sort of like terminology. He's sort of Viking Age, he's sort of medieval, in as much as like Scandinavia's Middle Ages starts after their Viking Age, right? He's sort of a Viking, but he's, you know, I mean, in some ways he's very much a Viking, but he's also a king, very much a king, right? And a mercenary and a city founder and a church builder. So I think he makes a great Civ leader because of that, right? If you're actually concerned with like Civs, civilizations, then Hardrada is arguably way better than like Lothbrok, who is a mythical character, for instance, right? No offense to the TV show, but like he's almost certainly, we know less real stuff about him. I don't want to say he's like completely fictional, but also like Harald Fairhair is a really great example of someone they could have picked, who is ostensibly the first true king of Norway, right? You meet him in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. He's not exactly the antagonist, but he's, you know, the sort of, whatever the literary term for the person who makes you leave home is, right? And he's in a lot of sagas, so he would have been a really interesting choice. But he's also, again, kind of Arthurian character, right? Like, he's probably real, but like what we actually know about him is pretty legendary, right? Whereas Harald Hardrada is a real, like, historically documented person, right? So I think when you look at the Civ leaders, right, you get this really interesting sort of grab bag of like very real people, you know, like Teddy Roosevelt, and somewhat less real people, you know, like Tomyris, and, you know, and sort of in between people who, like, you know, Genghis Khan, we know very much a real person, but like what we actually know about him is somewhat, you know, mythical. So Harold actually, I think, splits the difference kind of nicely, because he is both larger than life, but also like very much like a real person.
Yeah. And I think from the developer's perspective, I mean, just guessing here, but it seems like his life and the fact that it went over so many areas of the world at that time makes him an appealing figure. You know, this is somebody that, you know, pops up in Constantinople, and, you know, pops up with the Rus, and, you know, pops up in England. And so, you know, that kind of life that touches on so many areas of the world, I think helps them imagine this person, their personality, you know, vis-a-vis how they're different from other areas. And so, and I would imagine that would also help in the writing for this character, which, you know, it's kind of stereotypical Viking stuff, you know, the delivery of lines, they're kind of his persona during diplomatic conversations. But still, I think that kind of lifestyle, that kind of history must have been appealing for the developers. And just really quick, there is some mention here of Harald Fairhair here in the Civilopedia entry for Norway. They've also got Leif Erikson, of course. And so, yeah, it's interesting. You know, it seems like there was actually a lot of different options that they could have gone with. And, you know, like they did in previous games, maybe even some different kingdoms other than Norway that they could have used as a proxy for the Vikings.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you mentioned that scenario pack, which I had never encountered, but I poked at it this morning a little bit because I owned it. And right, so they've got Knut again. And then they've got, I'm blanking on the Olaf, I guess, of Sweden, right? So they've got all three kingdoms there. But again, it's interesting that all three of those guys are late Viking Age. You know, they're my favorite, you know, my personal Viking guys are all super early because that's just sort of how I work. I work in the 9th century. And the first, you know,
you like them before they became popular, right?
I'm a Viking hipster. But, you know, like the very first documented Scandinavian king we know about is a guy named Sigurd. And we know almost nothing about him, right? So they're probably not going to use him, even though, like, technically we know he existed. There's a guy named Godfred who is he's like a fascinating person. He founded one of the first urban town sites in Scandinavia. He gets into a personal like fight with Charlemagne. Like Einhard is the big biographer of Charlemagne, and like he says like this guy was puffed up with vanity and was, you know, thought he could conquer the Frankish Empire, and also he gets apparently cloven in two by a jealous son. Like literally the Latin says he gets like cut from the top of his head to his groin.
Wow.
So he's like an interesting character, but again, he's around for like 10 years and he appears in one source and then he disappears, right? Like, you know, there's because it's pre-literate, because it's semi-mythic, like there is in some ways a limited number of interesting Vikings that we know about.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, and that makes it difficult. Although, you know, it hasn't stopped other games like Assassin's Creed from just, you know, making up leaders and making up personalities whole cloth. So, but right. I feel like Civilization they try to cleave a bit more closely to historical record.
Yeah, well, and it's a fascinating thing watching them try and do that whilst simultaneously try and do the game, because you end up with these really interesting, like, you know, I remember on Reddit a lot of sort of grumbling about leaders that were being picked, right? Mm-hmm. And especially because it's Reddit, unfortunately, a lot of grumbling about a lot of like rando female leaders, like why pick I'm blanking on her name, the Medici Queen of France, right? Catherine
de Medici, yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, why pick her and not Napoleon? You know, like, but it's like, it is interesting to think about all of the people who have been rulers and how do you use them and how do you find them? And especially for, you know, there's almost like a two-sided coin problem, which is like, if you're going to do America, you have a lot of very well-known leaders it could be, right? And that could get boring after a while. It's been Lincoln, it's been Washington. What are you going to do next? If you're going to do like the Aztecs, there's, you know, I'm sure an Aztec expert would say like, well, there's tons of leaders, but like, who do people know? It's gonna have to be like Moctezuma or, you know, Cuauhtemoc or like,
and it's been like, Montezuma.
It's gonna have to be the two people everybody knows.
It's been Montezuma since the very first Civ 30 years ago,
right.
And he's been in each edition of the game. He's one of the few, including Shaka and Gandhi, who have been in every single version of Civilization.
And Gandhi's interesting because you basically have to have Gandhi as a legacy character.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
How people make their
He's
Gandhi
a meme clear. As much as he is a real person. Yeah.
Right, but like if you're gonna do the, you know, the Javanese Empire, like who's that gonna be and how are you gonna do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the Vikings, you can play around with it a little more and there are a number of them, but it's interesting how if you actually get down to brass tacks. Or, you know, you could pivot and go non-Viking, but I think people would be very disappointed, right? Like Sweden is a non-Viking leader. It's, you know, I don't even know who she is, some early modern leader. I mean, you could go Gustavus.
Gustavus Adolphus, yeah.
You could go Gustavus Adolphus, which I believe they've done in a past one, you know. But
too many E's in Sweden there, Bob. Christina.
Yeah, right. I don't really know anything about her. She's the Minerva of the North, okay.
So early modern.
Her father was Gustavus Adolphus.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, so if it's not Gustavus, then it's daughter then. So, yeah, interesting. Well, so let's talk a little bit about this idea of quote-unquote civilizations. And, you know, back when this game was first developed in the late 80s, early 90s, the idea of studying civilizations was still very much in vogue. And, you know, kind of idea of studying arbitrarily constructed groups of people and usually looking at them from the ancient era going forward. And so this mode of history is very much out of fashion these days. And I'm wondering, given this fact, what do you make of the game's depiction of the Norwegian civilization? And in particular, what do you make of Norway as a stand-in for a supposed Viking civilization?
Yeah, I think to sort of take it backwards, right? Like from a Viking perspective, okay, sure, like, but again, Viking is Viking a civilization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is always that interesting thing of like, I talk with my students a lot about this. Like, Viking is a career, you know. It's like being a lawyer or being a farmer or being a king, right? You can do it as a hobby. You can, you know, again, at times, Harald Hardrada is a Viking. At other times, he's a king. Sometimes, like, so like saying like this is a Viking civilization is it's like saying this is a lawyer civilization, right? This is a teacher civilization. You know, like it's a weird conceptual thing. It's also, again, like in some ways it's very important period of time for Scandinavia, for Norway, in as much as it's like the Viking Age is this transformative sort of liminal spot wherein like before the Viking Age, Scandinavia is largely disconnected from the wider world. Not completely. There are some very interesting trade links with Rome, for instance. You know, like the runic alphabet is very clearly the result of contact with Rome. But after the Viking Age, we can, you know, speak about Scandinavia as a part of Christian Europe, right? Of Christendom, to put it in a medieval sort of context. So it's like simultaneously very important, but also like it is a period wherein they are developing cities for the first time, and they're developing centralized government for the first time, you know, as much as we can say that for medieval. And they're, you know, converting from Norse paganism to Christianity. So clearly it's a step on a longer sort of path of development, right? But like, this is the same country that now is, you know, a Scandinavian, you know, socialist democracy, right? And has tremendous, you know, petrodollars and stuff. Like, how does that relate to the Vikings? If it's just Vikings, that seems to ignore a lot of other moments in Norwegian history, right? And of course, for much of the, you know, before the Viking Age, we can't even talk about Norway.
Yeah.
Right? So like, when you compare it to, you know, any other civilization in the game, right? It's a pretty arbitrary choice when you're starting, as we said, right? Like, you're smashing all of these things together. So you have, you know, classical era Greece with Pericles next to Viking Age Norway. Well, those are, you know, separated by literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, millennia, you know.
And even more ridiculous, having an American civilization with Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. You know, so I guess like it's an interesting conceptual thing. Like, it's certainly not how we would do history as a craft, right? But I think it also appeals in a certain way. Like, it makes sense. It's how we kind of actually think about stuff sometimes, for better or for worse, right? And of course, it fits into this narrative of clash of civilizations, which again is very much out of style, I think, in the actual craft of history, but is still, right, a very popular conceptual idea. You know, and this idea that you can weight civilizations and say which civilization is culturally the most advanced, right? There's actually a lot of really problematic elements of it if you really start to break it down. I think the game sort of is inherently tied into those things, but largely tries to avoid them by making it possible to win with any, and to make, you know, and like does some interesting things where like each culture has its quote unquote strengths, right? Like, but still that very idea is that there are strengths and weaknesses is, I think, problematic from a sort of craft perspective if we're thinking about historians and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so you said you use this sometimes with your students. So, just to talk inside baseball here for a moment, what kind of work do you do with this game with your students? Is it the type of thing where you have specific assignments where they have to play it, or is it the type of thing where you just have them go and look at some videos online and look at the representation?
Mostly it's about the representation, because unfortunately I have yet to convince the university that video games can be something we subsidize. Right?
Yeah.
You could probably get away with it.
I know that story too. Yeah.
You could probably get away with it for something like Civ, because it can run okay on anybody's computer, really. And it runs on Mac and PC, but it's a lot harder if you get into, like I would love for my students to play Assassin's Creed Valhalla for at least a little while, but there's no way that's, a guaranteeable sort of thing. So mostly sometimes I'll stream it in class and we'll look at it, or maybe I'll make them watch this podcast next time.
Oh, nice. Hey, good idea.
But for the most part, it's about sort of looking at videos, watching trailers, and usually it's tied into larger assignments about, like you said, representation. I teach a class on what I sort of call modern mythicization of the past. In medieval, we actually have a technical term, which is medievalisms, which is the sort of modern, or not even modern, but like post-medieval imaginings and recreations and usations, that's not a word, and the utility of the medieval.
Yes.
So medievalisms is like a technical term. There's a million books about medievalisms, and we really look at like how do we think about the past? How do we use the past? In the context of Vikings, it's a sort of very interesting, but also fraught. Ooh, a +4.
I know. I was just looking at that.
Raise your,
I guess,
your rainforest.
I know, but I think it might be worth it. I mean, +4.
That's
the bananas too. Maybe I should go with this. Well, this +3 is right next
+3.
to a volcano.
Yeah, but if you stick your science center there, and now we're getting. I've gotten distracted by the game. It's a pretty good city spot.
Yeah, let's do it over here. Yeah. Okay.
What was I saying? So Vikings are really interesting, right? Because we love Vikings a lot, right? So we have a million video games about them. We have a million movies about them. But the way that love manifests has gotten really icky in some very noticeable ways, right? Like I was getting 1.5 million Facebook pokes about the QAnon shaman, the Q shaman from the insurrection, because he's covered in quote unquote Viking tattoos. Yeah. Incidentally, he has a valknut on his chest, right? The valknut is the symbol of Harald Hardrada in this game, right? It's that little 3. I don't know if you can make a bigger picture of it, if there's a way to.
Where would that be? Would that be in the Civilization?
It's in the starting thing. It's you can sort of see it on next to all of your little cities there.
Oh,
but it's essentially
okay. Let me get past this and make a eruption.
Decided it needed to tell us.
Yeah. So this is in the Norway. Norway?
Right. Everybody has their little symbol. That is the valknut, exactly. Those 3 triangles overlapping, right? And it's it's a symbol. It's a nice symbol for Norway. Sure, why not? In part because it's on. I just lost the name of the ship burial. One of the most important ship burials. Let's see if I can Google fu it very quickly. It's associated with Odin. Sure. I'm sorry to do this. The Allsburg ship. That's it. Which is one of the most famous Viking Age ship burials, and it's carved into the prow of the Allsburg ship. So it's a great symbol, but also it is now a symbol that has been very clearly co-opted by, hate groups. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about representations, right, like there's some really interesting stuff where like there's video games, and then there's also like videos of Oathel rune burnings, right? They've replaced cross burnings. These groups have replaced cross burnings with rune burnings. So you can really see the way in which modern ideas about Vikings can go in lots of different directions, right?
Yeah.
And Civ is great for that because they really are trying to like boil down the Civ to its like recognizable composite pieces.
Yeah.
You know, so like the Norway has to feel right. It doesn't have to be accurate or right. It has to feel right.
Yeah.
You know, the Mongols have to feel right. They don't have to be accurate. They have to feel like, if you're playing the Mongols, you want it to feel like what you imagine it to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, as Sid Meier put it, you know, he recently wrote his memoirs this past year, and as Sid Meier put it, the history that's in Civ is the history that you'll find in the kids section of the library, right? Or, you know, an elementary school library. It's the type of history that you think you know, even if you don't actually know it. And so, yeah, I think, yeah, that's exactly the point you're making there. It's the kind of the history that you feel like you have some ownership over, even though you haven't read about it since, you know, you were probably 10 years old or 11 years old or something like that.
Right. And if you're a buff, they throw in little bits and pieces here to make it really interesting, right? So like Nidaros is a great choice for, you know, the capital. Tromsø is great, but also like Riba and Birka, they give, you know, like those are the first towns, you know, like Kaupang is an option. When you found these cities, you get the names of the important cities, right? And so like, if, you know, most people probably don't know about Kaupang and Skiringsskal, right? But they're the first, it's the first urban center for a given degree of urban, right? We're talking like a couple hundred people. But it's the first quote unquote city in Norway, right? And so you see it pop up, and if you know anything, you're like, oh, cool. Right? But it is like, it's all sort of distilled down to its perfect essence. And that's, you know, like you have to have berserkers. Yeah. Even though berserkers are like super unclear what's going on there. You know, they're semi-mythical at the very least.
We've got kind of Old Norse source and then a mention of Odin, and so it's like, oh, okay, well, were these real?
Right. Well, and again, like the source for almost all of this stuff is Snorri Sturluson.
Yeah.
And in the context of Snorri Sturluson, Odin is just a dude. He's a magic dude, but he's a dude. He's in fact a Trojan dude. Right. The way that he sort of the Aesir. He does this great thing. Medieval people love creating false etymologies. And so conceptually, the Aesir, who are the sort of Norse gods, that is derived from the fact that they come from Asia, which is like a wonderful, like not at all true etymology. But Snorri is a Christian, and so he's trying to create this sort of link between history and mythology and the real world. Right. These berserkers are mentioned as the warriors of Odin, who are like, you know, magically imbued with his power. Okay, that's very clearly just mythology. They come up occasionally in sagas where they basically come off as like weird, sort of like antisocial sort of bullies most often. Like they're usually the villain that the saga hero sort of defeats, because they're, you know, these like guys who you can't take anywhere because they get into fights and, you know, try and bully people around and mess with farmers and try to steal their daughters, right? But they're everywhere. Like they're what people think of, you know, and does it mean bear warrior, right? Are they wearing bear skins, or does it mean bear warrior? They're going into battle naked, right? Like there's all these debates about this group of people who we have almost no verifiable evidence about their existence, but you have to have them. Yeah. Right. You could just as easily have said like the special unit is the Viking, and that would have been more accurate, right? But less interesting. Yeah. And less, it wouldn't have scratched that itch that people have. Yeah. I often make the joke that like they're not making, you know, Viking Age Farmville. even though, of course, the vast majority of people during the Viking Age in Scandinavia were farmers, right?
Yeah.
But that's not what people want to play. To a certain extent, I think I'm wrong because, there are things like, I'm blanking on the name of the huge breakout success from last year.
Yeah, Animal Crossing.
Well, there is that,
and
but
then
the Viking Valheim. Is that it?
Valheim. Yeah.
Right, like that lets you do some base building.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit like, but I want to play that Viking Age Farmville or Viking Age Animal Crossing where most of your activity is fishing, and every once in a while you get to go on a Viking raid or something.
Yeah, I think a lot of players might share that sentiment, but at the same time, I feel like games like Civilization get it right, because if you're going to play a historical game, you don't want to be just Joe Schmo, digging a plot of land in the Dark Ages. You want to be a Viking raider. You want to be the king of Norway. There's a lot of play acting that goes into these types of things, historical play acting, and imagining yourself in these kind of pivotal roles in history as part of the power fantasy.
Right. Like even in something like Kingdom Come Deliverance, which came out, I forget exactly when, a couple years ago now.
Yeah.
Right. Which sells itself on sort of being an ultra realistic sort of thing. Like at the end of the day, you don't stay a farmer.
Yeah.
There is room for some interesting social mobility and, and it's also late medieval. So like that makes a little more sense, I guess. But right, like it's not Mountain Blade Peasant. It's Mountain Blade Warband, right? Like, all the peasant stuff is abstracted largely.
Yeah.
Which again, I sort of understand. There's often that question, like, if you could go back to any time, where would you go? And it's like, not the Middle Ages. It would be terrible. Right? Like, I don't think it would be very fun to actually be in the Middle Ages, but that's not what video games are for, right?
Yeah. All right. So my last question here, and maybe think about this with your students in mind. Do you have any recommendations for the developers of Civilization going forward, either with regard to Norway, the Vikings, or something else related to this franchise?
That's an interesting question. I saw you asked that in the email, and I was like, recommendations. I mean, I think in some ways, like they did an attempt at a Viking Age scenario, and it's not very good. And I say this both as someone who poked at it a little and as someone who looked at the Steam reviews. It's not very popular. But you can clearly see that they're trying. It's called, Vikings Raiders or Traders and Raiders, which I love because that's
let me take a look at that real fast. I'll save this and let's go take a look. You keep talking. It'll take me a little while to get there.
Right. Like they had this idea that like they're going to try and capture the essence of the Viking Age, which is this idea of like they're not just Vikings; they are also traders and raiders, right? Like there's this whole world of the Vikings. But at the end of the day, because of the way the game is sort of made, you still end up with 3 kings. And it's all super late, even though your opponent on the continent is Charlemagne, inexplicably, who died, in 814, which is a good 200 years earlier than.
But not that Charles, the other Charles, right? Isn't that the argument you can make?
Except they call him Charlemagne.
Oh no! Well, that ruins it right there.
Yeah, and also like by the point where any of these 3 guys exist, Canute, Harald, or Olaf, like. There's no Carolingian Empire anymore.
Yeah. Wow.
They're not even Carolingian kings technically anymore. Not in West.
Shows you what I know about the medieval world.
That's okay. I'm getting, it's a little bit inside baseball, but again, clearly, like if you're going to do this Viking stuff, it's going to be tricky, right? The big thing that we're talking about in the Viking Age now is this idea of diaspora. Mm-hmm. And Harald Hardrada is actually a really great example of the Viking Age diaspora because, again, like he has all these connections to all these different places and he can go abroad and there are diasporic communities that he can hook into. That's why he can go to Constantinople. That's why he can marry a Rus princess, you know, of Swedish descent. That's why, you know, like ironically, Harald Hardrada tries to conquer England and fails, and a different Viking, you know, diasporic member of the community, you know, William of Normandy, who is himself, of course, descended from Vikings, gets it instead, right? It's hard for me to imagine how you would get at diaspora, because one of the things that Vikings are so good at is going to places and adapting, right? Like, so, but it would be interesting to think about, like, is there a way to build that adaptability into the Civ that you're going for, to show that it's not just about hitting people over the head. It's also about serving as a mercenary and joining, you know, converting, or, you know, conquering or settling or finding new areas. In some ways, Civ is actually really great for that, right? Like Vikings go out and they settle in places. But because it's such a binary of conquer or be conquered, right? Like it's hard to get at that sort of flexibility aspect of the Vikings. Which is too bad, because I think that's one of the most interesting things about them, is that they are incredibly flexible in their willingness to adapt to circumstances.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I like this idea that you've got of, you know, kind of actors below the level of, say, the kingdom or below the level of the nation state, you know, because I feel like with the world as it existed in the early 90s when the Civilization game was first developed, it made a lot of sense to kind of have civilizations, but then also stand-ins for nation states. And that created a really compelling game, right? Now, obviously, they're obviously going to make a Civ 7. You know, it's going to go on and on and on and on, probably outlive both of us. But, you know, it kind of crystallizes the game in that kind of early 90s into the Cold War mode where we're thinking about nation states. And there's not really that many moments in the series that I could think of where there are sub-state actors, you know, other than the quote-unquote barbarians in the game. There's not many moments. Or the
city-states.
Yeah, or the city-states. And there's not many moments where you get, I'm thinking as a modern historian here, where you get displaced people, right? Whole groups of people who are within nation-states but are not actually a part of that nation-state, or not part of that kind of same modern ideology. And so, yeah, I think, you know, there is a opportunity there, but I wonder if maybe Civ is too stuck in its ways. You know, I've had this conversation with all the other historian guests that I've had on the show so far, and one of the things we keep coming back to is like, oh, sure, there's some ways you could change this, but then would it still be Civilization? Would the game still make sense?
Yeah, because I mean, like if you're playing as Babylon or as Gilgamesh, right, like you should not be conquering cities.
Yeah.
You should be taking over and creating hegemonic empires. You know, like those cities should all be sending you wealth, but they should still be largely independent political actors in their own right, right? Founding cities, and then, you know, or even like the Aztecs. And the Aztecs are a perfect example of a hegemonic empire, wherein like they don't actually control via direct political action all of the various other groups in Central America, right? They control them by threats of power. And that is actually one of arguably the key reasons why they are unable to, you know, resist the Spanish, because the Spanish make alternate deals with a lot of people who are very tired of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to think about how you would accomplish that sort of like vassalage or hegemony sort of situation, which is much more realistic for the pre-modern period than this idea of nation states.
Yes.
Right. Which is very much a like Treaty of Westphalia sort of like
absolutely
modern idea.
Modern sovereignty. Modern direct empire rather than indirect empire. Yeah. There's all sorts of opportunities.
And I guess the scenarios are sort of where they poke at that idea.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's interesting. Like you can play as Pericles or you can play as Alexander, right?
I think so,
or Gorgo. It's been a while since
so that's the interesting thing about Civ 6 is they split Alexander away from the Greeks, and so now he's Macedon, and then you've got Pericles and Gorgo for Greece.
Right. This idea of multiple different flavors of Civ, I actually really like, because I think it is a more accurate representation of how these things work. But of course, the other problem is that it's always anchored to a leader.
Yeah.
Again, that's a very much tied into that sort of great man or occasionally great woman, idea of history.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how would you do this without that? Is interesting to consider.
And the leaders for Civ 6 in particular, they've really leaned into the leaders as an avatar for the players to attach to, right? And so like when you go into the game and you're setting up your game, you don't pick a Civ, you pick a leader instead.
Yeah.
And that's the first time they've done that for the series. Previous iterations, you're always picking a Civ first, you pick America, and then you kind of get attached with the leader after that point. But now they're kind of leading in with the leader as an avatar for the player.
Ends up with some weird little funky things though, because of course in the speech when you start as Harald Hardrada, Sean Bean in all his Sean Bean beauty mentions Odin, right? I forget what exactly the speech is, but he mentions Odin, and of course Harald Hardrada is Christian. He's born a Christian, that's his thing. And also, knowing that, they have made the unique building the Stave Church. Right? Like, the unique building for the Vikings is a Christian building, which I actually kind of really like, because it does allow for some, complexity, because that's one of the key sort of elements of the Viking Age, is that transition from Norse paganism. But of course, when they're doing the speech, everyone wants to hear about Odin, because Norse paganism. Right? So you get this weird thing of Harald Hardrada does not care about Odin. In fact, he wants to wipe out the worship of Odin. So making it about Harald Hardrada, but then also it having to be the Vikings as we conceptualize them in our head with Norse mythology makes for some weird sort of moments of dissonance.
Yeah,
because they've hitched their wagon to basically two different sort of things. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that happens a lot with these types of games, and it happens with other historical games as well. So, I don't know.
Well, I think we talked about it, but I've been playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla again, just because you mentioned it. I was like, I should play that again now that it's summer. And the sheer amount of written documents you encounter in pre-literate Norway is just wild. There are scrolls everywhere. You walk into a cabin and there's just a little note. And they're so attached to this idea of info dumps via a little clickable thing, right?
Yeah.
They just sort of say, nah, forget it, written documents.
Yeah. But then otherwise it's oh yeah, all this Odin stuff, all this paganism, with this is definitely got to be in the game, and it's that's really funny. Well, I think that does it for me. Any other lasting points that you want to make? I know you might recommend this video to your students. So just to those students who might be watching, I say,
do your reading.
Do your reading, read the syllabus. And as far as I'm concerned, you all get an A.
Yeah. And video games are legitimate topics of academic study.
Yes.
And don't let your mom or dad tell you different.
Yeah. Go and tell your dean to give us some money for these games.
Yeah.
And
tell Bob to do an Age of Empires episode and invite me on. I'm actually better at real-time strategy than I am at this.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I might put you to the test on that. Maybe we'll have a Age of Empires 2 face-off, and rather than a traditional episode, it'll be you and me against each other.
I'm gonna have to get my macros together.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Civs 101.
Pleasure.
Thanks.